Thank you for choosing to watch our video. Please like and subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon for notifications of new content. Leave us a comment and watch the other videos that we're happy to provide for you. And now, on to the sermon.
I think a lot of people kind of misunderstand the whole part of commands as far as God's concerned. They think that, it's not that they think, God is a God of grace. There's no doubt about that. And it almost becomes this idea that because God is a God of grace, it's like He can't give us commands. It's not right for us to have commands. But we do. And there's a good reason for those commands. It's because God is a holy God. And when He has His children, which is all of us, He wants us to be holy. How do you produce that? You have to tell people what to do. You know, when you're an employee and a boss wants you to do something in a certain way, the only way to do that is to communicate it. If you want to call it commands, then you can, because essentially that's what it is. And the fact that God is gracious doesn't take away the fact that there is something for us to do. But it's something for us to do for a higher, nobler, holier purpose, to get us the kind of people that God wants us to be. And we've got 1 John chapter 2. So looking in 1 John chapter 2, and let's just read verses 3 and 4 because this kind of sets it up. Now by this we know that we know Him, if we keep His commandments. We commented about keeping God's commandments this morning just from 1 John chapter 5. So John has a lot of connection. John is the apostle of love, but it's funny how many times he connects love and keeping commandments. So in verse 4, he who says, I know Him, and does not keep His commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. That's harsh. I mean, that's as black and white as you can be. So tonight, as you can kind of see, we're going to look at difficult commands. And you might be thinking, well, the difficult command, maybe these really hard, these really heavy commands like don't murder, don't bear false witness, don't have any graven images before me, don't covet your neighbor's wife, these big, heavy commands. But it's not that way at all. In fact, the point of view from this lesson is we're going to look at commands that's actually pretty difficult for us to follow. And they shouldn't be, but nevertheless, they are. So we've got several of them. We're going to look at them at a quick fashion just to try to encourage us to actually look at God wanting us to be holy. How does God get us holy? So one of the first ways, and I can't even imagine that we're going to touch every area of what it means to be holy, but we are going to look at some of them. So we begin, and I think fundamentally, philosophically, we have to begin with people choosing the Lord. So let's go with us in Joshua chapter 1, verse 7. Go with us to Joshua chapter 1, verse 7. These are the instructions actually by God Himself to Joshua. So Joshua chapter 1 and verse 7, here was the statement, only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all of the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it from the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. The book of the law will not depart from your mouth, but you will meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you'll make your way prosperous, and you'll have good success. You've got to choose the Lord. And of course, choosing the Lord, and this is kind of a side point, but it's a major point in our lives. Choosing the Lord means that I've got to choose to follow what He's communicated, the commands that He's telling me to do. Chapter 22, look in verse 5. Down in chapter 22, verse 5. Now, in Joshua chapter 22, in Joshua chapter 1, of course, it's not only the first part of the book, but it's the first instructions that Joshua is getting as a new commander of God's people. Joshua 22 is all the way at the end. This is essentially Joshua's last statement to the children of Israel. In verse 5, but take careful heed to do the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you. to love the Lord your God, to walk in all His ways, to keep His commandments, to hold fast to Him, and to serve Him with all of your heart and with all of your soul. So I can do all of this stuff. I mean, I can serve Him, I can do what He commanded, but what is integral to all of that? It's loving the Lord. And choosing the Lord means loving the Lord. Let's go in John chapter 21. In John chapter 21, choosing the Lord and loving the Lord means serving Him. So John chapter 21, this is right after, we're picking it up in verse 19. This is right after the exchange between Jesus and Peter. Do you love me? Etc. So in verse 19, then He spoke, He signified what death He would glorify God. And when He had spoken this, He said to him, follow me. Well, then Peter, turning around, saw the disciple whom Jesus loved. This is the way that John referred to himself. John, who was also had leaned on his breast at the supper, and he said, well, Lord, who is the one who betrays you? And Peter, seeing him, said to Jesus, but Lord, what about this man? Jesus said to him, if I will that he remain until he come, what is that to you? Then look at the direction. You follow me. You follow me. I've got to choose the Lord. If this, and I think that putting it this way is, I think, a real common way that we would understand it in our language today. I've got to choose the Lord. People in Revelation chapter 3 in the church at Sardis. Church at Sardis was the dead church, if you'll remember. But look what happens in verse 4. You have a few names, even in Sardis, who have not defiled their garments, or they're not spiritually dead from the context of what was going on in the church. But he says, they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. Why are they worthy? It's because they did His will. Now, how did they do His will? It's because they chose Him. Everything begins with you choosing the Lord. Every part of your life, every bit of what you're going to be spiritually begins with you choosing the Lord. I know that a lot of us got our start because of parents. And parents who brought us, parents who lived as a good example, Bible class teachers who did the exact same. But there comes a time where we make this changeover to doing everything, not because someone expects us to, but because we choose to. And we choose the Lord. That's a difficult commandment. Difficult commandment. Here's another one that's not terribly easy. Love your enemies. Love your enemies. We would probably think that loving our enemies, well, that's a New Testament concept. In fact, some of the points that I'll make throughout the lesson is that God actually has always wanted people to do this. This is just a standard of righteousness. And the standard of righteousness really didn't deviate from the Old Testament to the New Testament. If it's New Testament law, it's going to be restated in the New Testament and given to us. But it's the same stuff that was back in the Old Testament. Here's one of them, Exodus chapter 23. Exodus chapter 23. And this is just a random piece of information that the children of Israel were given. And it's actually relatively detailed. So look with me in Exodus chapter 23 and verses 4 and 5. Look at this. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. What does it prove? You know, look, you're a good person. And a good person does good all of the time, whether it's to someone that they love or whether it's to someone that they don't love. And some people, I know, at times in their life are not lovable. Maybe all of us go through a season like that. But if you're an enemy, God says you need to love your enemy. You help them. And I like the fact of using Exodus chapter 23 as an illustration, because it doesn't just give me an abstract statement, you love your enemy, but it takes that abstract statement and it makes it into something extremely concrete. If you see your enemy and your enemy needs help, then you're going to help them. Similar with Job chapter 31. Let's go there. Job chapter 31. You know, one of the statements that Job makes, and we'll turn back to Job again before the end of the lesson, is that Job instills, the book instills so many good principles, and sometimes those principles, of course, are stated by Job, but sometimes, even though the friends are what we would consider to be not great, They even have at least good, solid, righteous principles that they will bring up from time to time. Job chapter 31, and let's look in 29 and 30. If I have rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up when evil found him, indeed I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his soul. I don't look to do wrong to my enemy. In fact, in Proverbs chapter 24, verse 17, that's the famous place. You don't rejoice when your enemy falls or when they stumble, when they have bad fortune, when difficult things happen to them. In fact, Exodus chapter 23 kind of acted to the reverse. When some misfortune does beset your enemy, you help them. And that's what loving enemies means. And I know it's a difficult commandment. Another difficult commandment that we'll look at, don't even start, is not to worry. So let's look. Psalm 55. Let's look in verse 22. Psalms are really, really good with worry, surprisingly. You don't normally think that the psalmist is going to be the place that you would go to and see these passages, but look in Psalm 55 in verse 22. Cast your burden on the Lord, He'll sustain you. He'll never permit the righteous to be moved. Or we look in Isaiah chapter 26. Isaiah chapter 26. This is an interesting passage. Isaiah chapter 26, we crossed over in this with the ladies' class about, I believe this section was 3 months ago. Isaiah 26 is in a block of teaching from 24 to 27 about judgment. And it's a big worldwide judgment that's coming on humanity because they've been unrighteous. Isaiah had went through a section from 13 to 23 where he's got all of these nations, and every nation had these specific judgments. And then it's like he tied it up in this big section at the end of that little section to show that everyone who does unrighteously is going to be judged. But right after that, in 26, you've got kind of a little hymn, a little psalm. And this psalm says this, beginning in verse 1. In that day, this song will be sung in the land of Judah. We have a strong city. God will appoint salvation for walls and bulwarks. In the theoretical idea of Isaiah, this great city was the city of Jerusalem. But if you kind of understand it, it's any place wherein righteousness dwells. So thinking about that, going on into verse 2, open the gates, that the righteous nation which keeps the truth may enter in. You will keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on you, because he trusts in you. Trust in the Lord forever. For in Yahweh the Lord is everlasting strength. And that's, again, not easy to do. It's not easy to do. We face stuff. We know that we face stuff. We say don't worry. We know we shouldn't worry. Then we worry. It's difficult. But one of the most encouraging parts to me is looking at people who went through, something that was truly, truly terrible. Daniel chapter 3, that's why I've got Daniel 3 in front of you. Daniel chapter 3, look at what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of course, had to go through. You know Daniel chapter 3 with the fiery furnace. But in Daniel chapter 3, with the fiery furnace, they were given the chance to fall down, worship the image. They didn't do it. Nebuchadnezzar gave them, probably thinking in a very kind-spirited, very big-hearted way, going to give you the opportunity to do it again. Maybe you didn't hear me the first time. Maybe your youthful rebellion needs to be correct. I'll give you a second chance. In Daniel chapter 3, verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. So you've given us a second chance. You've went through all of the instructions a second time. And it's kind of interesting. They're lengthy. It talks about all of the musicians that are there. When they play, you fall down and worship this image. We don't need to answer you. And I take from that, there's probably a few different little ways that it could be stated, but I take from that our answer the second time, respectfully, is the answer that it was the first time. And they didn't seem to worry about what was going to happen in the furnace. You look on down in verse 17. If that's the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us from your hand, O King. And I've made the comment before, just in thinking. Here were these men who had this trust that God was going to deliver them. Okay? But to me, what's so amazing is in that moment in history, no one had ever been saved from a fiery furnace, ever. And here were these three young men saying, look, Nebuchadnezzar, we know that God's going to deliver us. Well, why? Because all I got to do is look at the other 20 times when God's delivered people from a fiery furnace. It didn't exist. It didn't exist. As far as I know, no one even anticipated that you could physically take people out of the fire and they could be saved by God Himself. But they believed that it could. They didn't worry about it. And then they finished up with this great statement in faith in verse 18. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. They kind of compensated a little bit. We're not going to do this. It's not right to do. Our God will deliver us. But even if He doesn't, it's not right for us to do. We'll trust in Him. So whatever we worry about, we've got to accept how difficult it is. That if it changes in our favor, it's wonderful. God should be praised and thanked. And if it doesn't, then somehow God will give us the strength and the grace to make it through it. It's a difficult command, but we need to remember the people who trust in the Lord, those are the people who are going to be blessed. Those are the people who are going to get their answer, or those are the people who are going to learn how to rally through the power of God to handle whatever takes place. It's a great thought, just a difficult commandment. Let's go to Psalm chapter 37, talking about our anger. Psalm 37 in verse 8. Anger is talked about a remarkable amount of times in the Old Testament and the New Testament because it is such. First of all, it's just this incendiary emotion. But secondly, it's just so easy. Is it not? It's just so easy. You've got this before you on the screen. Think about that first one. Choosing the Lord versus expressing your anger. So which one is easier? You know the answer to that. So what does God, in trying to help us to be holy people, what does He do? He gives us instructions like Psalm 37 verse 8. Cease from anger, forsake wrath, do not fret, it only causes harm. Or if we go to Ephesians chapter 4. Let's go to Ephesians chapter 4 and let's look in verse 3. Ephesians chapter 4 verse 3, because this brings in the point of what we're all trying to do, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. So what's the enemy to that? Well, it's anger. It's anger. In fact, anger is pretty much the enemy to just about everything. Anger is the enemy in your home, because it will destroy the relationship that you have with your spouse. It'll destroy the relationship that you have with your children. Get your anger under control. It'll destroy the relationship that you have in your workplace. Either you'll have employees that want to flee, or you'll end up being fired because why? You can't control your anger. It'll destroy your reputation in the community. People learn that you're a hothead, that your natural way to respond to anything is to just explode. And one day you'll look around and you'll think, why do I feel so alone? It's because you've driven everyone away. So endeavoring to keep the the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. That's what anger does. Anger is going to destroy. Now look down in verse 26. Because in verse 26 there is, of course, the very famous instructions. Verse 26 reads, "Be angry, do not sin, do not let the sun go down on your wrath." Let's pick up Colossians chapter 3, verse 8, because Colossians chapter 3, verse 8 is a fuller text. Here's what I mean by this. Colossians 3, verse 8. "But now you yourselves are to put off all of these." Here's why it's fuller. So there's anger. There's anger. Then there's wrath. Then there's malice. And I think I can say, loosely said, anger, wrath, and malice are kind of three different, progressively worse ideas of the expression of this very, very negative emotion. Anger is exactly what we've all experienced. Wrath goes just a little bit further. You know, Paul talks about the outburst of wrath, when not only are we angry, but we're absolutely able and willing to make sure that everyone knows it. So anger is a little more internal, wrath is more external, and then malice kind of gets you to the very bottom of this base emotion where you're actually wanting to do someone harm. So Paul says, you put them all off, along with all of this other stuff in Colossians chapter 3, 5 through 8, just a long, long list of sins that are unrighteous. They're unholy. If children of God do them, they are not consecrated people. So what's the command? Well, you get control of it. Because in getting control of it, you become the kind of person that God wants. The Scriptures are more than just lists of do's and don'ts for the sake of doing stuff and not doing stuff. It's in existence to make us holy people. And us being holy people means that all of our relationships are better in every level, along with our relationship to God. And that's important for us to follow, again, nevertheless, very difficult commands. Here's another one. Let's go to Genesis chapter 40. And thinking about others, of course, the kind of the exact opposite of anger with others is thinking about others. So Genesis chapter 40, this takes us into the life of Joseph, where he's interpreting dreams. He's got the baker and the butler. In Genesis chapter 40, verse 13, he's telling, let's actually pick up some context. Go back to verse 12. Joseph said to him, "This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you were his butler." In verse 14, though, "But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me, make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house." So Pharaoh's going to let you go. Of course, the interpretation to the baker is right after that. The baker learned he was going to be put to death, but he said, "Please remember me." Then you get down to verse 43, and of course, what does it say? He didn't remember him. He didn't remember him. We think about others. We consider others. Back to Job. I told you that we'd take one more visit to the book of Job. Job chapter 6 and verse 14. This is actually Job speaking. In Job chapter 6 and verse 14. So the beginning parts of Job is more harsh with his friends. You understand the way that the narrative unfolds. Job's friends come to him, and they really kind of set in on this thought, and they didn't give up on it. And the thought wasn't necessarily wrong. Their point was, Job, you are suffering because of what you've done. If you'll just repent, God will take all of this away. Well, of course, we know that sometimes you actually do indeed suffer because of what you've done. But in Job's case, that wasn't true. And that's what sets up this massive amount of tension in the book and ultimately helps us to learn how to walk by faith when we're righteous and bad stuff just happens. So Job is fighting. He's contending sort of with his friends. And Job chapter 6 verse 14, kind of at the beginning of the book, the beginning of these rounds of conversations they have with each other, Job says, To him who is afflicted, i.e. me, kindness should be shown by his friend, even though he forsakes the fear of the Almighty. So that's put a little bit oddly in the New King James Version. Essentially, that means that kindness should be shown by his friend, because if you don't, you're forsaking the fear of the Almighty. You're pulling away, you're giving up a little bit on God when you don't consider others and when you don't think about others. And again, just like I said, sometimes people are unlovable. Well, sometimes people are kind of, in a sense, unthinkable. It's hard to think about them. It's hard to think positively with them and for them. They make it difficult. Nevertheless, that's why we're studying it as a difficult commandment. Even in 1 Corinthians. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Again, Old Testament and New Testament, these ideals are timeless. So 1 Corinthians chapter 10, look with me in verse 24. So in verse 24 of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, let no one seek his own, but each one the other's well-being. And then we look down in verse 33, the end of the chapter. And in verse 33 it says, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. I need to think about others. I need to consider them. And again, even when people aren't the easiest in the world to do that to, I need to be that way. It is very common, a very, very common part of human nature, that it's easy to love people when they're below you. It's easy to love people when they're below you. It's easy to love someone when they're not as successful as you, when they don't have as much money as you. It's easy to love people when they don't have as much family structure as you, or in 100 different ways that you could define satisfaction in your life. It's easy to love people when you're at a higher plane in some way than people in life. Half the congregation's on social media. You know what I mean by this. You look at people online. Maybe it's people that you graduated with. Maybe it's people that are neighbors. And they're doing really, really well. And probably mostly you're happy. But there's a little bit of jealousy. You know, jealousy is that fear. Jealousy and envy go together. Jealousy is that feeling that you feel bad that someone else is doing well. Envy goes one step further in that you kind of actively wish that whatever is going well didn't really exist. So jealousy and envy are kind of brothers and sisters of one another. And how many times have we thought that? How many times have we thought that? It's a big temptation. That's why the command to rejoice with others. You might think, oh, that's great. That's easy. Finally. One that I can handle. Can you? Can you? Sometimes not very easy. Let's look at some spiritual guidance here. Let's turn to Psalm chapter 5 and verse 11. Psalm chapter 5 verse 11. In all of these we've offered up some good spiritual guidance. And again, we offer up good spiritual guidance by going back to exactly what? The same book that gives the commands. So the same book that gives me the commands is going to tell me how to fulfill the commands. Psalm 5 verse 11, but let all of those rejoice who put their trust in you. Let them ever shout for joy because you defend them. Let those also who love your name be joyful in you. My capability to rejoice with others is directly dependent upon my good relationship with God. Because if I've got a good relationship with God, if my mind is oriented properly toward what is good and right and holy and spiritual, then it just flows down and affects everything else. And I can be the kind of person who can rejoice with others. I can be the kind of person who isn't full of jealousy and who isn't full of envy and who looks at him and wishes that all of that could just be taken away from someone else. No, I can be the kind of person who can actually rejoice. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 26. This hits closer to home for us in a spiritual point of view. 1 Corinthians chapter 12, I'd kind of painted it a little bit earlier with the idea of social media, that this is just random people. Maybe it's your own brother or sister. So 1 Corinthians 12 verse 26, and if one member suffers, all of the members suffer with it. If one member is honored, all of the members rejoice with it. And I think by and large, that's exactly what you find of good brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ all over the world. Why? Because they've tried so hard to be remade in the image of Jesus Christ. And if this is a real temptation for you, if it's really, really difficult, then maybe you need to go back and look at that being remade in the image of Jesus Christ. Revelation chapter 19 in the 7th verse talks about after the battle of Armageddon. Revelation chapter 19 verse 7 is as Jesus is being presented as the great conquering king. Verse 7, let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come and his wife has made herself ready. Why can we rejoice and be glad? Because we have victory in Jesus Christ. When I find that victory, then I can find rejoicing for everyone else and with everyone else. So, one more. Don't speak evil. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 24. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 24. I went the route of speaking evil because speaking evil has a much wider net. At least it throws a much wider net. So by speaking evil, we can talk about the kind of evil, wicked words themselves that can come out of people's mouths, profanity and euphemistic speech. All of the speech that we use that show that we are not of high moral, spiritual character. You know what I mean? It can also include evil speaking in gossip and slander and backbiting. We're not just relaying information about people and sharing information. If you guys want to go tell somebody at another congregation, hey, Kyle's having eye surgery, that's not gossip. But if we're intentionally saying things to other people to tear someone down, that's wrong. That's evil speaking. Again, you could wrap the ideas of anger and outbursts of wrath, and that could also kind of touch on the fringe of evil speaking, but we've already covered that. So evil speaking, as I said, it's a big net. And I don't think it takes a lot of imagination for all of us to understand the presentation of evil speaking. So Proverbs chapter 4, verse 24, put away from you a deceitful mouth, lying as well, evil speaking. Put perverse lips far from you. Let's go to Titus chapter 3. In Titus chapter 3 is a chapter that in the context talks about people who have been regenerated. So Titus chapter 3, looking in verse 1, remind them to be subject to rulers and authorities, to obey, to be ready for every good work. This is the relationship that we sustain to Jesus Christ. Here's a command. Why? Because we sustain that relationship to Jesus Christ. We're trying to be holy people. And then verse 2. To speak evil of no one, to be peaceable, gentle, showing all humility to all men. For we ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, deceived, serving various lusts and pleasures, living in malice and envy, hateful and hating one another. But what happened? The kindness and the love of God appeared. We entered into the washing of regeneration through His grace and mercy, and we were remade. And when we're remade, we get a handle. We get a handle on the evil speaking. We're able to stop it. James chapter 4, verse 11. James chapter 4 is a lot of just general statements that are made. This is our last one that we'll deal with tonight. James chapter 4, verse 11 just simply says, do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of a brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. God is ultimately going to be the judge, and God's going to judge our behavior. We don't need to anticipate. God's going to judge behavior. So don't speak evil of one another. Lots and lots of difficult commands. Like I said, I'm not in any way proclaiming that I've gotten all of them, but this is a decent sample. This felt like a lot of the ones that I've got to struggle with, and I figured if there are a lot of the ones that I've got to struggle with, there are probably a lot of the ones that we've all got to struggle with. David, in Psalm 119, specifically that 172nd verse, talked about how he's willing to proclaim the commandments of God to everyone. He believes those commandments are good and right. They're pure, and he wants to make it known. And we should too, because again, they are important. We normally look, for example, in Matthew chapter 28. Normally in Matthew chapter 28, and when we're looking all the way at the end in verses 19 and 20, look at this. We look at it from kind of a one-dimensional way. So go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So rightfully speaking, that is our mission, to go out and try to convert people. But look at this in verse 20. Teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. So what is part of all of the things that I've commanded you? It's the very 7 that we've looked at today. So the same commission that's told to us, that we all support, presumably, and that we want to then tell others, we've got to be willing to live by it ourselves. And they are tough. They are tough. But with the grace of God, with the wisdom of the Scriptures, with the strength that can be found in every one of us, we can put it away. We can put it away. We can gain control over it. Maybe not every second of our lives. That's why we still have the option to be forgiven of our sins. That's why we have grace, not to excuse us from anything, but to help us when we don't follow what God wants us to do every time in our lives. But we do it because God's holy, and He wants us to be holy. And the way that you become holy is you become His child. You become cleansed again in Jesus Christ. When you're cleansed, we were born in a cleansed, righteous state. We then sin. We're cleansed as we obey the gospel of Christ. If we get to the point that after we have become God's children, if we go back to that unrighteousness, there's hope for us. There's hope for us because that word presents it. So, in our presentation, or at least at the end of our presentation of what is righteous, we give you the chance, the opportunity, as we always do, and as we always should, for people to acknowledge, I haven't been what I needed to be. That is why we have an invitation that is now selected for all of us. If you need the prayers of the saints for your forgiveness and for your strength and your help to overcome some of what we've talked about tonight, that's why we're here. And that's why we have this time. And that's what we want to invite you to as we stand, and Jeremy's going to lead us.